Good morning, everyone. And Mats is running around. Yeah? Take a seat. Welcome to SEB for this joint workshop together with the WWF and CDP on science-based targets. My name is Jonas Solehav. I'm environmental manager of SEB Group. SEB committed to CDP 2008. We were also one of the financiers of WWF when they established themselves in Sweden 40 years ago. So for us, this is kind of reconfirming our cooperation, I would say. 2015 is quite an important year for the world. We have next week in New York the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals, the formal adoption. We also have the COP21 later this year. On a more moderate basis, this is quite an important year also for SEB. 2009, we took a plan to reduce our carbon emissions, our footprint, by 45%. And this is the year we have to deliver on that plan. Last year, we achieved -42, still some percentage to go, so I keep my finger crossed for that. Quite fascinating to see so many investors and companies here. As some of you know, we developed the concept of green bonds together with World Bank 2008, 2007. So far, I think we have helped clients to issue green bonds to a value of $40 billion US. This money dedicated for low carbon solutions, for energy efficiency projects. And, I mean, as you guess, of course, we're here to help you finance future development in the green area and carbon reduction projects. Once again, welcome to this workshop. I got some restrictions from the CDP to say that fire exits. Of course, we also say that so our guests are on the left and on the right. We have toilets around the corner to the reception, one stair below. So any questions, please reverse to me. Thank you. And Emma, now you will hear the real program for the day.
Thank you very much, Jonas, and thank you very much, SEB. We very much appreciate the opportunity to be here today in this fantastic venue and with delicious refreshments. So we very much appreciate your support. And welcome, everybody, on behalf of CDP and on behalf of WWF. This is, I think, one of the first joint events we've had for a little while. To this event, which is really by popular demand, I think it's fair to say. One of the reasons that this event has come about is that we received phone calls from companies saying, oh, science-based targets, I've read a bit about it, I need some help. Please, could you arrange a workshop to try and help us really understand what would it mean for us? So we had a fantastic, we've got a few seats empty here, I can see, but we were oversubscribed for this event. So there's a lot of interest, and we really welcome that. And on a global scale, we're seeing that as well. We have, certainly in the CDP Secretariat for the Commit to Action, we're getting a lot of conversations with companies. We're seeing a lot of companies exploring whether they can make a commitment in the coming months. So, and we've got a nice mixture here, as Jonas says, a lot of corporations, many Swedish, but also from overseas, interested in coming to and hearing this event, and a good representation from the investor community. So warm welcome to them as well, because of course this feeds into your work too. Samantha Smith from WWF is going to talk in a few minutes about making commitments, about taking the opportunity to commit. And CDP, through the We Mean Business collaboration, is working to convene companies on a pledge to set science-based targets, but also with some other pledges relating to committing to go to 100% renewable or to commit to a deforestation-free supply chain, for example. So please talk to me if you'd like to know more about any of those other pledges. But today we're focusing on the Science-Based Targets pledge. As you can see, we're filming today. We want to put this up on the internet so that we can share it with more people, given the amount of interest for the subject. So from that point of view, we won't be cutting and editing. So if you have any questions that you don't want to be on film, please save them for the breaks, and you can ask them directly to the people involved. Is that going to work? Am I pressing the wrong computer? Thank you. So here's our agenda for today. We've scoped in a lot of time for questions and answers and for coffee and chats, because I think this is very important in this kind of on this question. So we'll be taking a break in the not so distant future. But first, we're going to have an introduction by Samantha Smith, and she is leader of the Global Climate and Energy Initiative at WWF, and she's joining us by the medium of film. So, and what I've forgotten to say is, thanks for jumping up, Johanna. Johanna Mierman from WWF. We have Mats Landén here from WWF as well. We have Pedro Faria from CDP and Carol Tournay from WWF. So there's a lot of very knowledgeable people here. So you can please use the wealth of knowledge in the room. Okay, we'll go with the film.
Good morning, everyone. I'm very sorry I can't join you in person, but I'm glad to be with you, even if it's just virtually. So, as everybody knows, 2015 is a very important year. But it's not only important because the world's governments will try to get a global climate agreement in December in Paris. It's also important because scientists tell us that this is the year in which global emissions actually should be peaking and starting to decline shortly thereafter if we're really going to avoid dangerous climate change. And while I don't want to scare anyone, what we do want to get across is that it is really urgent now to act on emissions. Fortunately, people all over the world, all of the actors, people throughout society are starting to understand how important it is to act on climate change and to raise their voices. So we've seen the mobilization of faith groups, the world's Catholics through Pope Francis and his encyclical, but also of the world's 1.6 billion Muslims who have produced an Islamic declaration on climate change, calling on Muslims to act on climate change. And in addition, we've seen 400,000 people on the streets of New York at the People's Climate March last year. And finally, and last but not least, we've seen an amazing mobilization of progressive business. Now, it's not to say that businesses haven't done anything on climate change until now, because according to the Carbon Disclosure Project, CDP, our partner in this initiative, over 80% of the Fortune 500 have set emissions reductions targets for themselves. But despite these targets, corporate emissions keep rising, in fact, quite a lot. So what we know is that recording your emissions, setting targets, that is actually not enough. We're going to have to do more. What we hope you will take out of this event is exactly what does more mean. What more means, in the view of WWF and many others, is that also businesses must do their fair share in cutting emissions as required by climate science. Now, this might sound very abstract, but it is actually possible to determine not only for specific sectors, but also for specific companies, what is actually good enough in terms of the planet, and not only in terms of what your competitors are doing. We hope that by doing this, you will not only be contributing to saving the planet, but you will also be getting your businesses ready for the future that we know is coming. We see climate impacts all around us, every one of us. We see that 2015 is the year when we no longer can close our eyes to these impacts. But we also see that we're in the middle of a very exciting, almost revolutionary transformation of sectors, from transport to forestry to buildings, and certainly to energy. And so by getting your businesses ready, by setting targets that are in line with the kind of regulation that we know is going to come from our governments, you will be making sure that you're at the forefront, that you're ahead of this curve, that your businesses are ready to innovate and to be a part of this new economy. Now, the origin of this project initially came from WWF and CDP, both of whom have worked a lot with businesses on climate issues, have had programs about reporting and setting targets, sitting down and just thinking, this is not enough, right? We see that emissions are rising. And we also were able to bring with us other partners such as the UN Global Compact and the World Resources Institute, who themselves have vast experience and networks working with businesses on climate change. Now, we certainly don't have everything that is needed in order to start a business movement, a business groundswell of even more ambitious action on climate change. But from working with some of the early movers in the Science-Based Targets Initiative, what we see is that you all are ready. You're ready to take on these kinds of targets and to take on more ambition. So our role in this, and our role in this workshop, is two things. We want to show you the tools. We want to show you what you can do, what the methodologies are, who is already signed up, and how you can benefit from this. And then the other thing that we would like to do is, if you're ready to make these commitments, if you want to work with us and your peers in getting in front of the curve on climate change, we would like to celebrate you, because you too are part of a movement to fight dangerous climate change. So I'm sorry I can't be with you, as I said, but I hope that you will have a very successful workshop, and I look forward to hearing the outcome.
So good morning, everyone. I'm Mats Landén from WWF. I'm very happy to see such a distinguished audience with us here today, and I think we're going to have an exciting few hours, both talking about the broad things, but also about the nitty-gritty things, which is also one important purpose of this meeting. So I would like to just kick off and give you a bit of a flavor for already up front how this could work for a company. I would ask Pierre Börjesson from H&M to join me on the stage. Welcome.
Thank you.
You're senior expert, right?
Well, some kind of expert, yes.
Okay. I'll call you senior expert. In any case, you're responsible for the thinking and also the management of the climate agenda for H&M globally. Yes. So in relation to Samantha's message, what are your initial thoughts, and how have you addressed this issue in H&M?
Well, I mean, the whole concept of science-based we find to be very interesting and stand behind it, as we think it's a fantastic opportunity to collaborate across borders. In this case, it's science with industry, and how we have felt about setting goals when it comes to the climate area is that instead of us guessing what we perceive as possible and we go hard at it, we'll look at what science tells us, what is actually needed for the planet, and let the planet dictate the goals. And in that sense, see how we can contribute with our size, with our impact, to actually minimize and eliminate that gap from H&M and what science tells us is needed. So in that sense, I mean, I think it's a great message that we just heard from here.
So, I mean, in terms of process so far, where are you in your development in relation to this?
Well, we've taken on a Scope 1 and 2 assessment and looked into setting science-based targets on our own operation. Simultaneously in this process, we also looked into doing more than what this science-based would tell us, that would allow H&M to emit with our own operation when it comes to the global carbon budget. So in that sense, we wanted to do more and actually took the decision to go 100% renewable. So even though we've gone through the process of a Scope 1 and 2 assessment and set science-based targets on it, these goals doesn't make equal sense anymore with our decision on 100% renewable. So we've gone through a process. It was great for us. We learned a lot from that process. And simultaneously, we found this to be a good concept. And I believe we'll come into this as well. I mean, finding this to be a good concept on our own operation, and also knowing that our greatest impact is not only on our own operation, but where we can reach in our value chain. It's interesting for us to start looking into how we can actually create that difference and apply the same kind of thinking on our value chain.
I think it's quite encouraging to see. I mean, in a way, you've already sort of made scope 1 and 2 commitments. Sort of, it's not really relevant anymore because you've gone for total renewables. Although you just studied for scope 1 and 2, and then of course the remaining big part, maybe sort of 85%, is going to be in scope 3. I think it's interesting to see that lots of other companies, leading companies, are taking similar positions. Like Polarbröd, as you know, they've sort of invested, I think, 150 to 200 million in their own windmills in Dalarna, and IKEA are up for investments around, I think, 10 billion or something like, to be sort of totally self-sufficient for their own operations in a similar way like you're doing. But when we talk about scope 3, what's your thoughts about that?
Well, scope 3. Massive task, interesting challenges, and great opportunity for impact. Because once again, as you say, approximately 85% of our impact is actually outside our own operation. So in the value chain is where we can truly be sustainable and making an impact and have an influence. With our size, like many of our companies that we have here in this room, it's where we can make a change for the world. So to answer your question, it's a big task, definitely, but it's also a huge opportunity for us, and it's actually where it's needed, because it's not enough with just a company looking at 10%, 10-15% of its own emissions, but actually where the big emissions are. In our case, when it comes to, if we take downstream, the customer side, and everybody might not think so, but actually approximately a third of the emissions is coming from the user phase, actually when the product is already sold. So meaning when you wash the clothes, or when you tumble dry the clothes, and in the end also discard the items. So how can we work in this area here? Currently, we're working with a program called Clever Care for how we can motivate customers to actually take care of their clothes and products and shoes and such things in a much more responsible way, and minimize the emissions that is coming from the customer side. And in that case, also help them to save money, energy efficiency, of course. But then ultimately, how can we make sure that the textiles are coming back into the loop? So we have a closed system rather than buy, sell, throw, a linear system, a circular process. And that's really a huge environmental case. It's a business case, it's an environmental case. You can also draw it to a social case. So it's a fantastic business case for how you can engage your customers and how you can really affect your value chain. And that's just talking downstream. Then upstream, of course, we have a lot of emissions, so to say, a lot of opportunities. Once again, energy efficiency is so connected to cost opportunities. So yes, your question, yes, big task, big opportunities.
But I think it's also as really when you sort of in the stage that you're now, when that's kind of the real challenge begins, and also not only when it comes to sort of addressing the actual issues, but also how do you address the task of understanding your scope 3, because you could either go for sitting in your box and trying to understand the scope 3, which are, scope 3 is always somebody else's scope 1 and 2.
Yes.
So either you try to do that, or you maybe, which another approach would be to sort of bring together all the important players in your value chain and collectively look at the joint scope 1 and 2s.
Yes.
And maybe we could have some views about that later on, because I guess it's really, we get into a point where companies need to sort of understand how they best approach this challenge, also linked to what industry and business they are in. So I guess we might have some interesting discussions about later on. We shouldn't take too much time. Okay, sorry.
Okay, well, I think you pinpoint a very interesting topic there, because, I mean, in our case, we perceive a scope 3 to be a fast way forward. But in the future, perhaps actually it's better to just link all the scope 1 and 2s together. So in that sense, have a full, accurate value chain analysis. Yes, I think you bring up a very interesting topic. We need to, if we can answer that today, that would be fantastic.
We had a late night conversation about that yesterday, but I think from at least from an efficiency point of view of driving real change, because if you share targets with your peers in the value chain, you're going to be driving for the same kind of change. But that's another seminar most likely.
Yeah.
So I mean, you'll be around all day really.
Yes.
So there'll be opportunities to ask questions directly. If there are any immediate questions now, we have some time for that as well. Otherwise, we continue, and the questions will come later, maybe.
And just to tag on to that, I think there is enormous opportunities for collaboration here. So I'm happy to have further conversations with persons here today and afterwards.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Over to you, Emma.
Thank you very much. And I think I'd just put in on that topic, just to throw in CDP's work in that area. We have our supply chain program. We have about 65 to 70 big international companies who use the CDP questionnaire or use the CDP reporting process to ask questions of their suppliers and also to set targets, set their own internal targets for what their key suppliers will be doing. For example, Nokia has targets based on the number of their key suppliers who have set emissions reduction targets, and they're tightening that every year. So that's one example of a way to work with these issues. So now I'd like to introduce Carol Tournay from WWF, and she's going to introduce the Science Based Targets Initiative for us and give us a good overview. Thanks, Carol.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak today. Welcome, everybody, from my side as well. Just going to move. So Sam has mentioned it in her introduction. Despite a number of efforts that have been taken to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions, the emissions have actually grown in the past years and in the past decades. And you can see on this graph here that between 1990 and 2010, emissions have grown by more than 30%. Using this growth and projecting it into the future, which is the so-called business as usual scenario, we will reach about an average increase in temperature of 4 degrees by the end of this century. So this is, of course, not very good, and it will have impacts on different fronts. For example, on ecosystems, on humans as well in terms of water scarcity, reduced agricultural production, but also in general just climate vulnerability. According to a report that has been published by IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, emissions need to be reduced, and they need to be reduced by between 41 and 72% below the levels of 2010. And this is what you see on this dotted line. So we need to take more efforts to actually reduce emissions. And this graph also gives us a limited budget of greenhouse gas emissions that we are allowed to emit. This is just a very brief overview, and Pedro will explain the different budgets and how they are calculated more in detail in his presentation. Besides, reducing emissions, we also face other global trends. For example, the growth of global population, growth of the global economy, and we somehow need to manage to allow or to accommodate those trends at the global level and at the same time reduce emissions. So that's kind of the starting point. We also know that, well, we have current emissions of about 49 gigatons of CO2 per year, and as mentioned in the beginning, they have been growing in the past couple of years. And if we continue at this rate, so basically the graph, the business as usual graph I showed you in the beginning, we will run out of our carbon budget in about 20 years. Another important thing to understand is that actually a large part, about 2/3 of the fossil fuel reserves that are known today need to stay underground if we want to limit the global warming to less than 2 degrees on average. Sam has mentioned in her speech that we have seen in the past couple of years that companies are already starting to take action, which is positive. So we know from data that has been reported to CDP that actually around 80% of the 500 largest companies have already set greenhouse gas emission reduction targets or energy-related targets, which is positive. But if we compare this to the trends that I showed before, we have to ask ourselves, is it enough, or what else can we do? And yeah, as mentioned in the introduction, we started thinking on how can we get companies to actually align their targets with what is requested or suggested by climate science. CDP has published a report a couple of months ago in May, and it was an analysis to kind of find out more where companies actually stand at the moment. They have looked at 70 companies, and those 70 companies are responsible for about 9% of global emissions. The companies were in the sector, different sectors, so mainly high, heavy intensive sectors, heavy emission sectors, electric utilities, cement, chemical and aluminum sectors. And the analysis looked at historical emissions data on the one hand, but also on targets those companies currently have to actually see if those targets are ambitious enough or not. And this is the outcome. So on the green area, which is 38%, shows you that, yeah, about 38% of companies actually have targets that are ambitious or are in line with the 2-degree decarbonization pathway. Some have long-term targets, which is, of course, one thing that we ask companies to do as well, and some have more shorter-term targets. In the red area, you see that 35% of those 70 companies actually don't have any targets. And that's, of course, the negative note or the negative outcome from this report, that many companies don't have any targets, and then they need to do a lot of work to, you know, to prepare for the challenges. So this as a short introduction, and as Sam mentioned in the beginning, based on all these things, well, talking from the WWF perspective, we started thinking about what can be done and how can we get companies to become more ambitious. And by discussing that internally, but also with other stakeholders, we realized that we were not the only ones. There were actually other organizations out there talking exactly about the same challenge. And so we we joined forces with 3 other organizations, CDP, represented here as well, the UN Global Compact, and the World Resources Institute. And as you can see on the slide, our main goal is to raise the ambition level of corporate greenhouse gas target setting and make sure that corporate greenhouse gas targets are in line with what is recommended by climate science. We have set ambitious targets. So, and those are the targets that we have set jointly as the 4 partners of the Science Based Targets Initiative. At the end of this year, we would like to have 100 leading companies that commit to develop a science-based target. So I would like to explain you a small difference, and you will hear that again in the last part of the presentation, that we don't ask companies to have a target immediately, because we're aware that a company needs to go through a process, first analysis, but then also internal approval process to actually adopt a new target. So we want to get companies time to do that. So yeah, the second target is that at the end, by 2020, we want to have 250 leading companies that have a science-based target. And the third thing you see on this slide here is that actually with this, we would also like to positively influence policymakers. And this is very relevant, as you heard in the from the previous speakers. 2015 is a very important year. And yeah, we have climate negotiations taking place in Paris and at the end of the year. And it's very important to show them that companies are ready to take action. So just a very brief summary about what we have been working on in the initiative. So we kind of structured the work in two different work streams. The first one is to facilitate the adoption of science-based emission reduction targets. And this is what Pedro will explain more in detail. So we kind of developed some methodological approaches and guidance for companies to use to actually set such a target. So this is basically to build the foundation and give companies the possibilities to actually align their targets with what we request. And the other part is to incentivize companies to take action. So I briefly explained the Mind to Science report. We're working on an online tool that will be presented as a draft version in December as well, which helps us to do regular tracking of progress of companies. And the last one is a call to action, which I will explain in the last part of the presentation. Oh.
we hid a slide in the middle of your section.
Okay, good. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carol.
And we will have, I don't know if there's two questions right now, or otherwise we have a lot of time at the end.
Pernilla Bergmark Eriksson, just a quick question. You said the ambition was to have 250 companies on board, leading companies. Did you mean leading in terms of emissions or leading in terms of economic size?
So it's actually leading. Well, if they are on board, they will be leading anyway, right? Because if the companies take or adopt the targets that we ask them to adopt, they will be leading companies. We are currently focusing on, I mean, there are different levels. So we are focusing and we're doing many, reaching out to many companies at the global level, and the reports and things that we have done, which I showed or quickly explained, has focused on the 500 largest companies of the world. But in the end, each and every company needs to take action. So no matter how big it is and how relevant it is, it has to take action. Because if only a handful of companies take action, we won't get where we need to get. So, yeah.
Cecilia Ripinski from Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. I have a related question. First of all, I want to congratulate you to this good initiative. But you have this report where you identify which 70 companies that are responsible for a lot of the emissions. And you have also identified which ones of those that don't have targets or irrelevant targets, etc. Yet in your goals for this project, you're not necessarily focusing on those companies. You say 100 companies that are multinational, and there is a risk that those companies that are already leaders demonstrate their leadership even further, while perhaps you should be focusing on those 35% of those 70 that don't yet have targets to really have an actual impact. Have you thought about that?
Yeah, so thank you for the question, and I will start answering, and if you have anything to add, because you were more involved in the report, please do so. So the 70 companies is actually just a sample. So we focused on heavy emitting sectors because they are, of course, responsible for a large part of emissions. But it's just the start, and we also plan, to analyze, especially also with the tool that I quickly mentioned, to analyze a larger sample of companies and actually, know where they stand. So the report was kind of a first start. Can we say it like that, Pedro? Yeah. But it does not necessarily mean that those are the same. Exactly the same companies that are the most relevant. They are relevant because we chose relevant sectors or heavy intensive sectors. But we are, to explain the 100 companies better. So actually, if you look at the theory of diffusion of innovation, for example, you see that it's actually a curve. Of how new things are adopted. And if you manage to get a certain number of, in our case, companies, it can actually tip a lot or influence a lot more companies, right? So 100 is, we have set the number 100 and 250 more based on this tipping point. Yeah.
Yeah, if I can add something. I mean, we also have to set our targets in terms of what do we ambition in terms of this campaign. I would say for us there are two important things. One is to build momentum in order to, in this innovation process, is to build momentum, and there, everybody is welcome. It can be a small company, a big company with small emissions, or a small company with big emissions. Everybody is welcome. We want to build momentum. We need also to show momentum in order for, in the COP, to send a strong political message saying business are engaged. Now, COP is 3 months, so and we started this in May in Paris, so short time, everybody is welcome. I must repeat. Now, of course, our ambition is to get the big emitters. And that's why we analyze those 70 companies that represent such a high portion of emissions. And by the way, that graph was representing the portion of emissions of each company and not the number of companies. That will require a longer-term engagement. For example, tomorrow I will be in Brussels having a first meeting with Euroelectric, the Association of Power Producers in Europe, exactly because we want to engage with the high-emitting sectors. How they will take on board this message is something we will work with them. But it was very positive when we started this analysis to actually see that we already had several companies, the majority actually in the power sector, that had ambitious long-term science-based targets. They represented 11% of the emissions in the sample, so 1% of the world emissions. And yeah, what we want is to bring everybody into this mode of thinking. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
So I forgot carbon action.
One more question, or we need to?
Actually, just before, I was just going to add in a little perspective from the investor side that the CDP's carbon action programme is a step up from asking for disclosure from companies, but actually targets the 1,300 largest emitters that are listed globally and asks them to be transparent, but also to set targets and to demonstrate that they're investing in emission reduction activities. Through that programme, we are representing over 300 institutional investors. We are pushing that message as well.
Okay, thanks. My name is Bengt Brunberg from Billerud-Korsnäs. As I'm here to learn more about target setting, I'm a little bit curious about the group that had irrelevant targets set. Can you please just give a few examples so we may observe better what is not relevant?
Yes, so we had to define criteria in order to, let's say, classify companies into long-term, 2 degrees short-term, don't have targets. But then we had a group of companies that had targets, but I'm sorry, talking with my back to you, it's not nice, I'm sorry. We had a group of companies that had targets, but they represented 2% of their emissions. So just to be cynic, we had in particular one power company that had a very ambitious target for 1% of their emissions that represented their fleet. And then nothing in relation to their emissions of power. That's irrelevant.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I'll hand back over to you.
So I thought we just pop to that next slide. I thought you might be interested to know which companies have already made this commitment globally. We have 52 companies already committed to setting a science-based target, and those are up on screen there. Sorry if they're a little bit on the small side. And we have H&M, Hennes & Mauritz, proudly displayed there, but otherwise, a lack of Nordic companies as yet. I would say that doesn't reflect the level of interest at all. I would think that reflects the level of maturity in decision making, perhaps, not rushing into things. So, but we hope we can help convince you today to take that step and commit. And with that, I think it's time to break for some coffee. So we can move through to the room where we were before. We'll start again at 10 past, thank you, Salah. At 10 past, and we'll be herding you through. But please take the opportunity to talk to all of these wise people in the room and get some ideas and some inspiration. Their seats, please. We're gonna move on, get going. I'd like to. You've already had a sneak preview of Pedro Faria, who's Technical Director at CDP. He's going to talk through the methodological approaches. Yeah, here's where we get into the nitty-gritty, so hold on tight. I hope the coffee was strong, because it's going to need a bit of concentration, but it's worth it. Thank you, Pedro. What have you got?
I hope you can hear me. Yeah, I think it's working. So good morning, everybody. Thank you so much to the SEB for receiving us. Thank you, Emma and Salah and all the WWF colleagues for organizing this and inviting me to be here. It's my first time to Stockholm. Really nice city. I haven't had a lot of time to actually see it. It's a really nice city, but it's not my first time in Sweden. Many years ago, I came, spent a weekend, and I went to the beach. So I think I am the only Portuguese guy that comes at the weekend to go to the beach in Sweden. It's a bit weird. Usually it's the other way around. I have very fond memories of that weekend. I spent it with Johan, my friend from Sweden, and his family in this hut. It was more like a real house, and then they had another hut in the garden. And there are two things I remember well. The first is that there were all these houses near the beach, and they all had poles with the Swedish flag. And I found very interesting. I asked Johan, and he said, well, you know, there's no summer if there is no flag, which is kind of, I guess, a tradition. And the other one was actually swimming at the sea. And I was very surprised because it was so warm, you know. Down there in Portugal, the Atlantic is much colder. And yeah, Johan explained, well, you know, that's the Gulf Stream brings the heat, and it creates a special climate in the Nordics, in the Northern Europe, which makes it a lot more amenable than, for instance, the climate in Russia or in Canada, where you don't have that warm stream. And of course, that brings us to the climate, because that's the type of feature of our climate that we want to maintain. We want to have a stable climate. We want to maintain the status quo of the climate, because that's what we know and we are used to, and we like it. In order to have this, what we know, and this is one of the kind of breakthroughs of the Assessment Report 5, is that we need to stick with a carbon budget. This carbon budget is defined as 1 gigatons of carbon, or 3,670 gigatons of CO2. That's what we can emit to the atmosphere if we want to contain increase the temperature to 2 degrees from what it was before the Industrial Revolution. Now, what happens is when you consider greenhouse gas forcings, other gases, methane and others, this budget gets reduced to 2,900 gigatons of CO2. And then when you consider the CO2 that we have already historically emitted from 1750 to 2011, that's around 1,890 gigatons. And so that leaves us with a remaining 1,000 gigatons of CO2. And of course, these budget figures, I'm using the central numbers. There is some dispersion. This is science. There's always some uncertainty, but these are the central figures. And also, all this has some probabilities. In this case, the probability is for us to stay with a higher than 66% chance within the 2 degrees. Now, if you think about this, this is slightly worse than playing Russian roulette. So we are playing Russian roulette with the climate. These are the main figures and also the figures we're discussing in the political process. But actually, if we wanted to decrease this risk, if we didn't want to play Russian roulette with the planet, we would need stricter budgets. So, sorry, but is a very hard reality. And of course, every year this budget gets reduced by the amount of CO2 and greenhouse gases that we emit to the atmosphere. 49, as Carol mentioned, is more or less the number now. I was asked a very interesting question when I was talking about science-based targets by a consultant, a carbon consultant. He said, so, okay, this budget, does it get renewed like every 100 years? I've heard that CO2 only stays 5 years in the atmosphere. And so I decided to address this question. I don't know if it would be a question that might appear into your heads, but I decided to address it here. And my question is, no, this is a perpetual budget, and that's one of the things that is quite also striking. The fact that the CO2 molecules only stay 5 years in the atmosphere can be easily explained. If we look at the size of the atmosphere, there's 750 gigatons of carbon there, and the atmosphere is always in chemical equilibrium with the other things it touches at the Earth, the soil, in particular the oceans. And there is a flow of 200 gigatons of carbon. And so if you divide that, you get an average residence time of 3-4 years of a molecule of CO2. But that doesn't mean that if you emit 1,000 gigatons to the atmosphere, maybe the molecules of CO2 are not the same, but that 1,000 gigatons will stay in the atmosphere and will disappear according to another curve, another what we call lifetime, a little bit like the radiation decay. And that is a totally different, it's totally different numbers. We know that 50% of that impulse of CO2 gets removed from the atmosphere within 30 years, mainly into the oceans. And when it goes into the oceans, it's also causing climate change because it's causing acidification and warming, etc. And then 30% will be removed within a few centuries, and then 20% of that CO2 impulse, of that emission that happens in a given year, will stay in the atmosphere for thousands of years. And this is kind of the physical reality that the scientists do their modeling, etc., and they realize that long-term climate change has actually a linear relationship with CO2 and with the historical CO2 emissions from the moment we began to introduce CO2 in large amounts to the atmosphere, so industrial revolution. And so the conclusion they got, and this graph, I wonder if is that there is a very linear relationship, even though the models are very non-linear, between CO2 emissions and increase in the global mean surface temperature. And this happens as a consequence of the large inertia of the climate and carbon cycles. Yeah, I mean, CO2 emissions largely control the increase in mean surface temperature that we will observe long term. And that's why we often talk of CO2. Of course, other greenhouse gases will have an effect in the shorter term, in transient of the transition of the climate. But in the long term is really CO2. So that is kind of the science that leads us to these carbon budgets. So we have a budget. How are we going to spend it? This is the big question that faces us all, and the scientists and the modelers have also looked at that in the assessment report 5. There is a wide range of scenarios, but in terms of staying within the 2 degrees, there is one main scenario, which is called the RCP, Represented Concentration Pathway 2.6. And this distributes the 1,010 gigatons according to this graph. Basically, emissions are expected to peak up to 2020. Around 2040, and with increasing deployment of renewable energy and low carbon technologies, emissions will have decline considerably in face of the peak in 2020, and carbon capture and storage is supposed to begin to kick in and be deployed for energy-intensive sectors. So we will actually begin to remove some of the CO2 that would be released. This is a central assumption of this scenario for us to stay within 2 degrees. And then finally, fossil fuel CO2 emissions would be net zero by 2070. So this would imply a big change in the way we operate our economy and societies. Total emissions would be net zero by 2085, and these include the emissions from fossil fuel, but also the emissions from land use change. And then from there onwards, we will be capturing CO2 into reservoirs. So this is the assumption. This is the main scenario that everybody discusses, and again, it has a 60% change of staying within 2 degrees. Now, this is how the budget is distributed in time. How do we distribute the budget between the several actors in the economy? And this is where we have been doing some work with WWF, WRI, UNGC, and looking at the models that already exist, and we also created our own. So I will be talking about models to distribute or allocate this budget, hopefully in a fair way, to business operating into the economy. And by looking at these several models, we kind of came up with a model framework. And the main components of these are here. Models are machines, little machines. In this case, it's a sausage machine. And they work with several things. So there are parameters, and in this case, the most important ones for us is the emission scenario and the time frame of the emission scenario. It's a key parameter of the machines. And then there is a kind of central engine that basically distributes that according to some criteria. And of course, there are input variables, which in the case of the sausage machine is things like the target year, the base year emissions, base year activity, and of course, they will produce some results, hopefully, which will be a target by a given year, a % reduction, or they might also produce a pathway to that target. I'm going to talk now about these allocation principles, which is how the distribution can occur. One of the simplest allocation mechanisms is basically saying, well, we have a scenario that has, says that we are here and we need to get there. So emissions need to reduce by 80%, 85% developed countries, 50% developing countries, and there are many numbers that we hear. We can just say, okay, so every company which represents just a small portion reduces proportionally. This is what we call absolute emission contraction. It's a very simple approach. Very straightforward, might not always be let's say, the most economically efficient. Some people might think, well, it's fair, everybody gets to reduce the same. But if different companies have different costs, it might seem to be perceived fair, but it might not be also the best way. It has one big advantage. It's really simple and simple to understand, yeah? The principle. One methodology that uses this, actually with a bit more complexity than what I was saying, is the 3% solution that was developed by WWF and CDP for the USA. Specifically, we looked at the US targets in 2020. There have been analyses in terms of cost-efficient reduction of CO2 in the US economy, and the conclusion was that a 3% reduction per year between 2010 and 2020 would meet the US targets and contribute to savings of up to 190 billion. And so this is the average figure, and then there are kind of different percentage dependent on the sector, but they will all be around this 3%. And everybody in that sector reduces proportional. So this principle of everybody reducing proportional is there. The other allocation principle is intensity compression. In particular, intensity, carbon intensity, which is expressed in tons of CO2 per value added, per GDP created, dollar of GDP created. And in this principle, basically, the rationale is, once again, we have a scenario. It proposes a certain reduction that a certain percentage per year. And we look at the economy and the projections of economy, and in this case will be 3.5% per year, which makes it that up to 2050 it will grow like 300%. And then basically we divide the carbon by the economic growth, and we see that the carbon intensity of GDP needs to reduce something like this. And then we say, okay, your company has a certain carbon intensity in terms of value added, and that carbon intensity needs to reduce at the same pace as what the world average would need. And this, of course, will need to intensity pathway for your value-added carbon intensity, which then multiplied by whatever is your value-added would result in a carbon budget. There is a mistake there. This is not 2%, but I'll just mention here. There are two main methodologies, or, well, there are several methodologies. There is one fundamental paper that talks about this approach, which is the what we call the GIVA paper, the greenhouse gas emissions per unit of value added, which is kind of this principle. It has been published by, gosh, I don't remember his name, Jorgen Renders from the Norwegian Business School. And this approach is described there, and basically he says if every business reduces their corporate greenhouse gas per unit of value added by 5% per year, we will be okay. Actually, he uses a scenario where world emissions need to reduce by 50% in 2050. So, of course, this 5% reduction is highly dependent on the scenario he uses, both for emissions reductions and economic growth. Another methodology is the one proposed by the Center for Sustainable Solutions. It uses a similar principle. They might plug in different scenarios. The other allocation principle is one that we developed for our sectoral decarbonization approach. This slide is a little bit haunting. You must say this spaghetti is actually scenarios, physical intensity scenarios that we derive from the IEA energy technology perspectives scenarios. And we use this as an approach to distribute the available carbon budget to companies. I'm going to do some, let's say, side comments on this. Intensity, physical intensity, it's built on CO2 and physical intensity projections of several sectors. What is worth seeing here? This line here, the blue line, the one that goes deeper down, is the power sector. So according to these scenarios, the power sector is the sector that needs to decarbonize more up to 2050, more than 95% from where they are now. And actually, this is shown as an index. So wherever they are in 2010, whatever the indicator in terms of intensity, this is the reduction. So more than around 95%. Then we have this green line, which is other industry. So it's the rest of the economy that is not here. And then we have sectors, some sectors that look a bit weird. So for example, here, the chemical industry. And we are trying to understand what is happening here. But the chemical industry is expected to have a big, important role in terms of the decarbonization, because they produce a lot of smart chemicals that help reduce emissions elsewhere. And there is an expectation of big growth. Also in terms of healthcare, there is a lot of growth, and we have a continuous population. And so emissions grow very fast and then they decrease. This is a bit strange. We're trying to sort out what is happening here. We have sectors that don't reduce as much. Some of this is actually quite tricky. Some of these sectors reducing are close to what the thermodynamics limits are in terms of, for example, producing steel. And so it will be very difficult to go beyond that. And so this type of considerations is taken in terms of the IEA modeling. So I just want to mention this, and we can talk about that later. Yeah.
Could I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
Sorry, there's a funny jump there. Is it rail?
Yeah, it is rail. So this funny jump is
Could you repeat my question?
yeah, so it was flagged that there is a funny jump here there's this pathway that goes down, up, down, which is rail. And what is happening is a mixture of mode shifting and decarbonization of the electric system. So it produces that funny pathway. Here, actually, how this works. This is a real company. In this purple, you can see their historical intensity. This gray line is actually their targets. And this dashed blue line is what is derived from the sector decarbonization approach. Basically, and the blue thick line is the sector intensity pathway. And so this basically illustrates how we set the pathway for this company. We choose a target year, and then from target year to, we choose a base year. From base year to target year, there is convergence of their intensity to the intensity of the sector in 2050. This defines a pathway of intensity, which then multiplied by whatever is their projected power production will produce a carbon budget for them. We can also see that they have actually, I would say, an ambitious target. The slope is clearly the right slope. It's some years delayed, but is not that bad. It would be better if it would be there, but they go a long way in the pathway that they need to go. This is a Chinese company, so it's particularly good. So we have seen how the allocation happens. Let me know if time-wise how I am. Sorry. Let's look now a bit more closer to the several scenarios that we can plug into these models. I've already talked about the RCP. The RCP is a global, non-sectoral, that includes CO2 and other gases, other greenhouse gases, even though they are not represented here. Sorry for that. It's the reference scenario because it's the one that has been kind of assessed and been the one with which, against all others, are compared in assessment report 5. We use the IEA ETP scenario, as I mentioned. And here you have a slightly different representation. You have the scenario in terms of absolute emissions. And this red portion is power sector. And so you clearly see that the main emissions reductions are according to this scenario, are coming from the power sector. And you can also see that a lot of the other sectors, there is a kind of an assumption of stability of their now carbon emissions or slight reduction. This, once again, doesn't assume that these sectors are not going to do anything, because this is just a CO2 scenario. If you look at the projections of activity, for instance, aluminium is supposed to grow like 3 times. And so that means that with the same budget, they need to get 3 times more carbon efficient. In many cases, close to what is physically possible.
Maybe you said it, maybe I missed that. Is this including non-CO2 emissions that are also greenhouse gas emissions?
Good question. This particular scenario, no. This particular scenario of the IEA is just about CO2. But what the other gases, you can include them as following the same pathway, and that would be conservative. That would be conservative. You went to.
I work with the agricultural industry, and methane from the livestock sector is a key.
It's so great question. Here, global sectoral, CO2 only, and certain emissions are not considered here. Land use change emissions are not, and agricultural emissions are not. Also, funny enough, emissions from oil and gas are not model explicit. So the upstream energy sector doesn't have a specific scenario. What is worth mentioning is that the total of this scenario, which is this gray top line, is compatible with the RCP, as can be seen here. It's slightly higher, but given the uncertainties, that's not too worrying. This is the scenario with which we release the first version of the sectoral decarbonization approach. We are now thinking of releasing more specific tools for certain sectors. And for that, we are looking at regional, sectoral, and in this case also CO2 only scenarios. These scenarios are intensity, so the CO2 scenario and the projection of power production, one divided by the other. And it basically represents the power systems and their pathways at different regions. So we have India here in green. I think the top one is South Africa. China is yellow. And funny enough, what we can see is also this convergence of all the regions to a certain area down here. And this is very important because the assumption in the allocation principle of physical convergence, there is this assumption that the business will converge in terms of technology and their intensities, which of course is a very important assumption of the method. But as we can see, is also an assumption of the scenarios. And yeah, this shows the big difference that, for instance, an electric company in South Africa needs to do compared, for example, this one, which is in Brazil. But everybody, independent of where they are, they have their pathway. And as we look to more scenarios, always 2-degree scenarios, we begin to see there is a wide range and there are all these assumptions and we need to understand them. And I've begun to work at this concept, which I call the scenario envelope, because there are so many scenarios, they all represent, possible futures. And basically where I try to represent here, when I map all, or the ones I know, scenarios, and I use the top line of the several scenarios, and then the down line of all the scenarios. There we get this envelope, this gray area of where the different scenarios are going. I represented here just a limited number, just to show that, some scenarios go and touch these points and then go somewhere inside this envelope. But it's going to be important to understand this envelope because they have very different assumptions in terms of power production, they might have population, technology, etc. And they also have different assumptions. For example, the scenarios that say, well, let's continue to emit up to 2030, they then go down very fast here and say, and then we need to capture a lot of CO2. It's probably not the best scenario to follow. Also because we really don't know how to do this yet in an economic and feasible way. And, this type of brusque transition doesn't usually happen a lot. So key components of the sausage machine, you can somehow blend them and produce different methods and proposals. I'm going to explain more about the sector decarbonization approach, where we actually ourselves blend two approaches, because some sectors is very difficult to produce an intensity, a physical intensity. The chemical sector, once again, is really tricky because they have these millions of products, and some are very carbon intensive, some are very non-carbon intensive, and so we need to do further work there. The SDA, the general concept. So we start from the objective of decontaining 2 degrees. From there, there is the global carbon budget. We talked about that. And then we thought, well, we want to use this method of allocation. We need to find scenarios that break the budget into the different sectors. They also need to have sectoral activity projections. And from there, we build the sectoral intensity. And then, finally, using the allocation principle of intensity convergence, we define the company intensity. This is, in a very summary way, the approach we are following in this method. It has some interesting features. One is that companies, that haven't been very proactive, they start up there, but they need to reduce faster. Companies that have been early actors, they need to reduce slower. This graph here, the upper right one, it basically illustrates the principle I've already mentioned. This would be the sector average intensity. This would, the dashed line would represent different companies converging. This is possible for what we call homogeneous sectors, so where we are able to define one physical measure that is homogeneous. The great example is the power sector. A megawatt hour is a megawatt hour independent of whatever. And then for heterogeneous sectors, we actually follow the principle of contraction, absolute emissions contraction. So basically, if the scenario says it reduces like this, everybody, independent on where they are, they equally reduce in the same percentage. We don't think it's ideal, but it's logical, at least. What else? This has a very important aspect also. We are able to build Scope 2 and Scope 3 scenarios. All the scenarios I've shown are about direct emissions. That's what in Assessment Report 5 and the scientists are concerned. In terms of greenhouse gas accounting, actually, we account for direct and indirect emissions. And in the indirect, we have Scope 2 and Scope 3. If we use the power sector scenario, we have very clearly what should happen with Scope 2 emissions. And that's actually what we do in this methodology also. We'll build a scenario for Scope 2 based on the power sector scenario, and then we use exactly the same principles. And this actually leads that, for example, Scope 2 reductions for most of the sectors are up and above 90%, because the reduction of the power sector in terms of their direct emissions dominates whatever increase of electricity consumptions that these sectors have. The big exception is the railway, because there's an expectation of modal shift to railway, electrified railway, and the consumption will grow faster than the reduction of CO2 intensity in the power sector. I hope I'm making sense. If not, I can draw, because this is a great room and has a board. But if I'm not making sense, just let me know. And we can also have budgets for scope 3. So, for example, we have a scenario for transportation, light vehicle road transportation, and that clearly has implications for auto manufacturers, scope 3 use of sold products. These sectors, scope 1 scenarios can be used to set indirect science-based targets. And here we have another example of how different scenarios and allocation methods are blended. This is the climate stabilization intensity targets, is an approach that has been used by BT, British Telecom, back in 2008, I believe. It follows that principle of intensity value-added compression. Basically, they use a different scenario than GIVA. GIVA assumes 50% reduction of CO2 up to 2050. Globally, they say, well, no, we are in UK, developed country, we need to reduce more. So we use 80% scenario, has the economic projections of developed countries' economic growth, and they say everybody should reduce their economic intensity by 9.6% per year. CFACT is a tool created by Autodesk that follows slightly similar principle. Basically, they propose to set targets using value-added, but it is constructed in a slightly different way. They say, well, emissions need to be reduced by 80 to 85% in the developed countries. We assume 85% reduction, but they don't divide by a generic economic growth of all companies. They say our growth in terms of value added is going to be this. We need to reduce 85 from our baseline. They include all the emissions, scope 1, 2, and 3, and so they calculate their own specific pathway. Sorry.
Thank you. Flemming Hedén from GS. It refers to your previous slide. I'm a bit slow, sorry. If I understand correctly, if I meet with two power utilities, which have one high carbon intensity and one is lower, but both of them are higher than the convergence scenario in the future, I should ask the high intensity power utility to say you need to reduce, in 10 years' time you need to reduce, but you will still be above where the low intensity started.
Yes.
That's a bit weird, since, if I, as an investor, want to invest in companies which will be profitable and strong in the future, I would go for the most efficient ones, and the one which starts with high intensity needs to do much more in order to be competitive in the future.
Yeah, well, efficiency in the power sector has many, carbon efficiency, but they can run a coal power facility very efficiently. Yes, but basically their fleet, they will need to transition. It's true that, for example, for the power sector, these pathways are too smooth. If you think of investment cycles, it is quite sure that they will not progress, smoothly like this, but they will go by jumps. And then they they retire one power facility and they will jump down more than following this smooth. But a company that is, highly engaged in coal production will have some difficulty to change like that. They might start buying renewable assets, instead of going through the difficult process of projects, identify sites, project, finance, etc. So that's basically the reality that these pathways are trying to capture. But yeah, I mean, in practice, they will not go smoothly. They will go by jumps because of the investment cycles. And the power industry is particularly important because it has long investment cycles, huge amounts of money, and that's why having the long-term perspective is so critical. So if I have a power company setting a target for the next 5 years, it's good, particularly if it is ambitious, but particularly for the ones that are more carbon intensive, the long-term perspective will be really important because they need to transition their assets. I'm not sure if I responded, more or less.
Yeah, sorry, this might be very stupid. I was just trying to understand, you said earlier, you showed us some different scenarios and you said that, for example, when you'd use is it called the EVPA? GIVA. Value, I presume, is always financial value. So GDP in the old-fashioned way of counting money per unit produced. Okay, so I was just wondering, because I heard in the beginning that you were talking about the fair share of carbon for each company. And if you go forward one slide, so for example, there are, in the CFAC there are formulations around what's fair in line with scientific and policy climate stabilization targets. I guess often when you want to make something foolproof, you refer to maths but fair has another connotation, which is just or justice. And I was just wondering if there are any assumptions around this. For example, when I saw the regional distribution, there are very different scenarios for different regions. So what's behind the regional distribution? Is there any kind of justice?
That's a great
behind that.
Yeah, thanks for that question. It all goes back to the scenarios, although there might be also other considerations. But for example, CFAC tries to address that question by using differentiated reduction efforts for developed and developing countries. And that's kind of the consideration there.
Is that what you mean by policy climate stabilization?
Where is that, sir?
How do we understand that they've done that? Is it by the...
Yeah, that's what they mean. This is based on assessment report 4, and at the time there was this proposal of 85% reduction developed, 50% developing countries, which already kind of considers that, equal but differentiated responsibilities. The scenario we are using, they are actually a more technocratic, if you want. They are based on simulation that considers the cost of abatement of CO2, and they minimize the overall cost and considering technology that is available and that is foreseen to be deployable up to 2050. But if you look, for example, here on the power sector, you can clearly see that there is differentiation between the regions. Now, is it fair? I'm not going to discuss if it is fair or not. I mean, there are many assumptions there, but for example, power sector, no, but cement sector, we are talking of global companies, truly global companies. They operate in Swiss and in Mexico and in China. I'm not sure that a regional differentiation makes a lot of sense. And we are talking about companies, not states, and not people. But that is a very important discussion in terms of climate and budget and all that.
Another question.
Yeah, Hello, I'm Gunnar Bengtsson from the Volvo Group. I'd like to go back to that slide with the two convergence and compression methods. That one, yes. I have two questions. I didn't fully understand which method of these ones do you prefer for a company?
My personal opinion, if I might. I actually prefer this one. The physical intensity convergence, because it's more linked with the physical reality, and I'm an engineer, and so I have a background deformation for the physical stuff, and so this is actually my preferred one. But we are not saying use one or use the other. There is actually a lot of debate about this, and I'm not here to cut the debate. I'm here to promote debate and to tell you where we are.
I think you said that the compression method had some kind of logic in it, and I can't see the logic with that one. I think that seems unfair. But I'm pleased with your answer on my first
well,
question.
I will not make a comment, but I think you.
It's within the sector, right?
Yeah, I mean it is within the sector, in the sector decarbonization approach. In other methods, it's global. But for example, I might answer your question by saying that right now the chemical industry follows this method, and we would like to go from there to here, because we think it would be more robust and more aligned also with what the industry needs. But this exercise of doing scenarios is really complicated, and we don't have the knowledge for that. I mean, I don't have a PhD. I don't know. I think nobody has a PhD or anything like that in this type of modeling and climate modeling. But we are very open to collaborate with the industry on this, definitely. Sorry.
My name is Casper No from Ecofis. We supported for NGOs with actually developing the methodology. This is really a key question. So maybe just two short notes to make on that. I think it is possible to make some sectors more specific. For example, there's also this sector other transport, which is now still all combined. We're now looking with one partner to make that sector more specific, to make more detailed and physical indicators for several parts of that sector. And maybe just shortly referring to your question, which might be interesting, is that there is a project ongoing now for agricultural sectors that are not included in the methodology, that is funded by the KR Foundation. And in the near future, 25 September, there's a public consultation workshop on that. And it will include 10 commodities. And partners are also, for example, University of Aberdeen and PBL. And we are hosting that webinar for 10 commodities. So.
Thanks for that note. I actually mentioned it in the final slides. I think I need to get going, but I'm okay. But it's very good, the debate. I just wanted to say one thing in terms, even though I prefer this approach, I have to say it is more complicated or more to apply, because we talk about your sectors as if they are a very easy thing to define, and all companies are easily categorized into one sector. Well, it doesn't happen like that, unfortunately. And so sometimes there are some difficulties there, and maybe more than sectors, we should talk about activities, because I mean, we are really talking about physical production activities, and the bulk of them that generate the bulk of emissions. Anyway, all these is kind of tried to be summarized here. We have been trying to see how can we categorize this to make the communication easier for our audience, and they understand where the different methods lie. And basically, we organize these metrics with the allocation mechanisms and the different scenarios. And we have put here some of the different approaches. So, for instance, the sector decarbonization is there with a global sector scenario. That's version 1. We are trying to evolve to non-global or regional sector scenarios, or in some cases even product scenarios like in the chemical industry. Other methods can, they can plug into whatever type of scenarios. An open question is, if everybody is using different things, in the end, we will be able to guarantee all these things make sense in terms of the budget. That's one big and central question. And for me, it depends on the ambitions, because sometimes actually the application of these scenarios lead to more ambitions that, for instance, the SDA. In other cases, it does not. So, I mean, the really important thing is to have the ambition, let's say the will to reduce emissions, and find an appropriate rationale to define the targets. Open questions. I mean, there are many open questions, and I guess you will have your own. And I'm very, open and welcome to receive those. We need to further understand and develop scenarios. As I mentioned, we want to refine some sector scenarios. For instance, we can distinguish primary from secondary aluminium. We need to understand better some sector scenarios like the chemical sector, and probably what makes most sense is to break it down between the several chemical commodities. We need to further develop scenarios for the sectors that are not covered. For instance, agriculture. Ecofis is doing that work with some universities already. We definitely need to better understand the scenario assumptions, because it's not just about CO2. There are other implications in terms of economic growth, in terms of distribution between different regions. More difficult even would be to understand what it means in terms of the wider society, some of those scenarios. For instance, when you go to agriculture, if we assume that everybody will go vegetarian, that's a very different scenario, but is it feasible? And yes, we also need to understand, in terms of the scenarios that are available, what are the ones that are still feasible and preferable to avoid the 2 degrees. In terms of methods, we need to understand the implication of using these different methods and how they combine with the different scenarios. I would say that the most simple methods, like the compression, etc., they need to be conservative, so they need to bring strong emissions reductions. There are other open questions. How do we address the needs of high growth sectors? Some of these methods really don't take that in consideration. How to deal with product substitution? It's this open question of some of, let's say, social and very personal choices. Can we substitute meat with soya? How much should we predict of that? What are the implications of that for feeding the world, etc.? How can new companies set targets? I mean, most of these methods rely on some measure of historical emissions. If you come completely new, what portion of the target do you have? Well, 0 multiplied by 0.1 is 0, So that's very constraining. The SDA actually has a solution for that, because it has this convergence approach, and they can adopt the starting point of whatever is the technology, current technology status. We also have the issue of top-down, which is what we are doing. We are using the top scenarios to set company targets. So top-down approaches versus bottom-up target setting, which is what companies would usually do. And it would be very interesting to analyze how these two things can match up. And then some open CDP questions, I would say, in terms of our programs, and in particular the climate change program. How will we check performance against targets? That's definitely one of the things that we want to do. We want to see the companies disclosing to CDP and being recognized as leaders, setting ambitious long-term, and I must insist in the long-term, because the long-term perspective here is very important, targets. There is an issue also about absolute versus intensity targets. Which one is best? Can we accept an ambitious intensity target, but that actually foresees an increase of the total emissions? How we incorporate this into our scoring methodology in terms of the detail, and then of course, how do we incorporate these also in terms of the reporting? There are many. There can be some complex, complicated decisions and things that need to be reported for us to fully assess the targets, and we don't want to increase the reporting burden. So that's also a challenge. And yeah, that's it for me. Questions?
Hello, my name is Ivan and I'm working for IKEA. Pedro, I have a few questions here. First one is that how companies who are vertically integrated should work with this, because for example, we are having production and we are having retail operations as well in our portfolio. So how to work in such a case? And I think that you have touched it with that activity-based approach. So does it mean that we should build more scenarios, or and how then to build them up together? This is first question. Second question which I have is how to work with market shares, for example, and market shares of company and contribution of the company to GDP in the sectors, and how to evaluate that in, let's say, contribution analysis or in one of the variables which can be used there. And third question which I have is about re-evaluation. So what are the recommended procedures to, let's say, confirm that we are on the way, or that the sectorial goal is valid, or that sectorial targets haven't moved in the time? For example, should we do it every 3 years, every 5 years, and then adapt our own goals, corporate goals, on changes in the general model, or reflect in our goals changes in the general model? So these are 3 areas which I'm curious, and I would like to hear more from you, if possible.
Yeah, thank you. These are interesting and challenging questions. So vertical integration. Again, you will have different activities. Some of those activities will fit into different SDA budgets or the IEA budgets. We allow a company, we have a tool, Publish, and we allow a company to plug up to 3 activities. It might not be enough. Hopefully it will be. I would say that, each company is a case, and some companies are very simple. No company is ever very simple, but some will be simpler, and some can get very complicated. In that case, you have several activities. I think, you need to see where are the main emissions in those different activities and production chain, and really focus on the biggest ones, and see if there are suitable scenarios and allocation methods that you can use in a sensible way. And that's why also, we are showing all these different methods, because often, one method will not fit all the different needs. The second question, sorry, I don't remember the second question, but market share.
It's consideration of the market share and innovation in the model.
That relates with one of the open questions I mentioned, which is also what we do with high growth companies. But specifically in the sector decarbonization approach, we consider market share. But I will be totally transparent on actually what we do. In terms of the math, if this is the sector average scenario in terms of intensity, and your company starts here, if this company is gaining market share, is growing faster than the others, if you do the math, the budget will not be respected. And so what we did is actually incorporate a factor for the market share. And the trick is this. The initial budget allocation goes if everybody has the same growth. Under that assumption, the math works and the budget is respected. If your company is growing faster, then that is considered into the equation, and this curve reduces faster. In order to maintain the initial allocation of the budget that assumes an average growth in line with the growth of the sector.
Where the y-sector is, y-axis is?
Intensity, sorry, and this is years. So in the SDA, we consider it in this way. Of course, all these hinges on, for example, will in reality the scenario be met? And one thing we can say for sure is that it won't, because nobody predicts the future with 100% certainty. That's why we propose under the SDA that we actually revise what is the status of progress in terms of meeting the target every 5 years. The IEA is committed to produce ETP and updates to their scenarios now on a yearly basis. So yearly basis is going to be difficult. To update all the tools and every year is going to be difficult. But every 5 years, it's a bit arbitrary. It could be 4, it could be 7, but every 5 years seems a reasonable window. I hope I've answered your question.
So I had one more question. I come from a big financial group. What can the tool give me?
Well, the tool can give you a pathway for your scope 1 and 2. But of course, your main impact is not that. It's your investments. Right now, as you probably are aware, there's a lot of work in that area. And the tool, or I would say these methods, do not address yet your questions. Yeah.
I'm sorry? There's more discussion of it coming a little bit later.
But it's clear that where you need to act most is not on that. I was talking with one colleague and I was saying, well, almost in terms of time, if you have to invest time, invest 25% in scope 1 and 2, and then spend 75% talking with your investment colleagues, because that's really where you can make a difference. But of course, this is a bit arbitrary. Eh? You will know best what you can do in that area. And we would be very happy to hear about your experience.
Hi, I'm Pierre with H&M. We discussed it briefly in the very start. Should we even conduct scope 3 analysis, given that that is actually other scope 1 and 2? What is your take on actually scope 3 and how to utilize that? Should we even do it? And once again, thinking of it that it is scope 1 and 2 for other businesses actually.
Yeah, I mean, I have a different from everybody, a different view, almost I would say, from everybody else on this issue of indirect emissions, because I don't separate scope 3 from scope 2. And scope 2 is also indirect, and most of you have scope 2 targets. But it is within your value chain. And for many of you, what can I do? I'm connected to the grid, and so I receive from there. So the challenge has a degree of similarity. But I think companies should definitely do the screening of their scope 3, trying to understand where their hotspots are.
We do have some. Carol's going to talk a little bit about that some more.
Okay.
Makes sense to.
There are some good examples of scope 3 setting. And I just want to say that in some cases, we don't have like scope 3 scenarios fit for scope 3, but in certain cases we do. And so that can help the engagement with your suppliers or the suppliers of your suppliers. You can set common targets based on some of that.
Thanks very much, Pedro.
Thank you.
I think we'll move on now. There's plenty more time for more questions later, but I think some of them will be answered with Carol's presentation now. So I'd like to pass over to Carol to carry on talking about the call to action and a little bit more about the practicalities.
Checking. It's working. Okay, so actually before I talk about the call to action, I just wanted to mention 2 points. Pedro has briefly mentioned the tool that is available. So for the methodology that we have developed, the sectoral decarbonization approach, there is an online tool available that companies can use to either check their current targets or also set new targets. And we just said that maybe we have some time after 12, half an hour for individual questions. So we could offer to show you the tool after 12, so you can have a quick look at it and see how it works. And then the second thing I wanted to mention is, Pedro gave you an overview of the different scenarios and modelings and the methodological approaches. We will be publishing a manual called the Target Setting Manual. It's available in draft stage, and we will publish it next week. And we will then go through a public stakeholder consultation. So I would like to invite all of you to participate in that consultation. There will be the possibility to give feedback online, but we also organize several physical workshops. We're still defining the details, but one will be in the US mid-October, another one will be in France in November, maybe one in South Africa and one in India, I think. So I just wanted to mention that, and you can find all the information about upcoming events on the Science Based Targets website in the events section. So this, just to make sure that I don't forget to mention this. So yeah, now about the call to action. You heard since the beginning that we would like to inspire you to start taking action. And I already briefly mentioned the targets that we have. So after having focused a lot on developing the methodologies behind that and giving guidance to companies, we really focus now to reaching out to companies, explain them how it works, explain them what it is about, and we really hope that we will be able to get a lot of interest from different companies, and that we will have many companies that are ready to commit to such a target. So first, just a very brief some bullet points about why a company should join this. You've heard a lot about the climate science background. It can also be interesting for companies to join because of other reasons. So, for example, risk. We haven't talked a lot about risk, but it is, of course, a very important topic for companies to manage risk. It can give companies a long-term competitive advantage. So right now, only very few companies have developed a science-based target. So you would be able, on the one hand, to improve your reputation, but on the other hand, just make sure that you will be able to have the products that you need for whatever you are producing in the future as well. So this is linked to both to competitive advantage and risk. It's burst innovation. In the past, many companies have identified measures and then kind of added them up and came up with a target. Now we kind of take another perspective. We start with a limited budget and show companies where they actually need to be in the next, by 2050. This, of course, triggers other kind of investment in terms of research and development or innovation. Regulation and policy, we've talked a little bit about that as well. It's very high on the agenda, especially this year. I talked already about corporate reputation a bit, and we have indications that it's also compatible with strong financial returns. I would like to explain you the process. So if your company is interested in joining the initiative, we have different steps that a company has to take. And as mentioned in the beginning, the first step is to just, in brackets, to commit to develop a target. So it's not necessary that your company already has a target, because we know that it takes some time to actually develop a target. So the first step is to sign a commitment letter. You see the template on the left hand. It's available on our website. You can just download the form, and of course, you would need to request all the internal approvals that are necessary to be able to do that. And then your company will get listed on the Science Based Targets website, but also on other websites, because we work very closely together with We Mean Business, for example. Science-based targets is one of the 7 topics that We Mean Business is currently promoting very heavily. The next step after taking that commitment is actually to develop a target. So you get 24 months to develop a target that is in line with climate science. I will talk about the requirements in the coming slides as well. Once you have the target, you need to submit it for quality check. And this is what is basically the next step in the process. So we have a form as well. Sorry, that was too fast. We have a form as well. I would say it's comparable with the data you have to report to CDP, right? We try to align it as much as possible to save you additional.
With a fewer questions.
Fewer questions, yeah, important. It's basically to just explain the details of your targets, and then this gets submitted to the team, the Science-Based Targets team, and we have a team of technical reviewers that actually go through the target or has a look at the target, and then the technical reviewer gives a recommendation to the steering committee of the initiative. So in the steering committee of the initiative, we have representatives from all the partner organizations. So Pedro is in the steering committee representing CDP. We have somebody from UN Global Compact, World Resources Institute, and WWF. And then based on the recommendation, the steering committee receives from the technical reviewer, it takes a decision whether the target is ambitious enough or not. And now to explain what is ambitious enough, we have developed a set of eligibility criteria that a target needs to comply with to considered as aligned with climate science and ambitious enough to join officially the call to action. We have talked about the different scopes already, and this is also what the first requirement is about. So the target needs to cover the company-wide Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions as required in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol corporate standard. So as you might know, the World Resources Institute is one of the two organizations behind the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, besides the World Business Council on Sustainable Development. So we also try to align, or to basically, to rely as much as possible on the existing guidance already. Besides the direct emissions and indirect emissions from energy, there is Scope 3. We have started talking a little bit about Scope 3 already. And the eligibility criteria for Scope 3 is that whenever Scope 3 is relevant for a company or covers a relevant part of a company's emissions, it's necessary to set a Scope 3 target as well. And a Scope 3 target, since it's much more complex, does not necessarily need to be science-based, but it needs to be ambitious. And just to specify what relevant means, whenever Scope 3 emissions are greater than 40% of the total Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, it is considered as relevant.
Good question. On the Scope 3 target, does it need to cover the whole of Scope 3 or an aspect of Scope 3?
I will explain Scope 3 more in the next slide, I think. So the next criteria is about the time frame. The criteria here is that the target needs or has to cover at least a time frame of 5 years after the time of announcement of the target. So it's not necessarily the same as the base year. And then, the level of ambition is basically all we have been talking about today. It needs to be aligned with the 2-degree decarbonization pathway. And then reporting, also very relevant. We require companies to disclose their emissions inventory on an annual basis to be able to track performance, basically. We have some additional guidance. So not requirements, but recommendations from our side. The first one is again about what time frame the target covers. Besides the minimum of 5 years, we strongly recommend companies to develop longer-term targets as well, so mid to longer term. It can be, either a specific target or also a long-term vision. But we think it's very important that a company keeps in mind the long-term perspective and actually the pathways that you have seen towards 2050, because that's actually what shows a company where it needs to go. Pedro has talked a little bit about intensity and absolute emissions. So the recommendation here is to express a target in both absolute and intensity. And the last one was basically one of the questions that was asked just before. It's about a recalculation of the target. So we also recommend that the target is recalculated on a regular basis. On the one hand, based on the company-specific data, but on the other hand, the input data of the different methodologies will change as well. So it's very important to kind of take that into account. Then some additional comments or guidance about Scope 3. I'm sure we will have a more detailed discussion afterwards. It's basically the different steps that we recommend a company should take in case Scope 3 is relevant for that company. So the first step is to do a Scope 3 screening, to kind of have the overview of the Scope 3 emissions and then be able to say which Scope 3 categories are the most relevant and where should the company focus on. I already mentioned that that a company needs to develop a Scope 3 target if it's higher than 40% of the overall emissions. And specifically about which categories, so the recommendation is that the target has to be developed, and it needs to cover the most relevant emissions categories. So an example on the slide here is that, for example, the top 3, but it always depends on the specific company, because yeah, Scope 3 can be very, very different depending on the different sectors. So, but the most relevant Scope 3 categories need to be covered. Since Scope 3 is always a big question for all of the companies, I have 2 examples here, which we consider ambitious. The first one is from Sony. Sony has announced new targets a couple of months ago, in May, I believe. And they have developed targets, on the one hand, a long-term vision, which is towards 2050. And the long-term vision or goal that they have set is to reduce their emissions by 90% by 2050. And this covers Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. Then they have set intermediate targets, 2020 targets, separate for Scope 1 and Scope 2 and Scope 3. So Scope 1 targets are to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 42% compared to the base year 2000. And related to Scope 2, they will increase the use of renewable energy to 300,000 tons of CO2e. This is equivalent, it's not in megawatt hours. And then why I chose this example is mainly also because Sony has looked in detail about into their Scope 3 emissions. And what you see on the slide is just a selection. So they have adopted different goals or measures for different Scope 3 categories. And what I will explain you here is just a selection of a large number of Scope 3 targets. The first one is to reduce the energy consumption of their products by 30%, and it's the same timeline as the timeline I mentioned for Scope 1 and Scope 2. They are also, Sony is also working with their manufacturers, and they want to get their manufacturers to achieve the same or to adopt the same emission reduction targets as Sony's owns. And they collaborate with suppliers of components with large environmental footprint to set and implement their own emission reduction targets. So they really also focus on getting their supplier to set their own Scope 1 and Scope 2 targets.
But the targets, they just... The targets, Scope 3 targets, the 2 last ones there, they are only qualitative targets?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's a mixture between quantitative and qualitative targets. For some Scope 3 categories, they have qualitative targets, and for some they have quantitative targets. Yes, correct. The next example is Ricoh, a Japanese company. Ricoh has also done an assessment of their all their emissions, so Scope 1, 2, and 3. And they have also set targets on the one hand for 2020 and on the other hand for 2050. And the 2020 target is a 30% reduction, and the 2050 target is a 87.5 reduction. And this is also compared to 2000 levels. So yeah, important here is that they really, looked in detail into their value chain and Scope 3 emissions as well. And I think both examples, as I mentioned already, the kind of can we say, new thing is that they really also set longer term targets, because many companies set more or less short-term targets, but both of those companies also have 2050 targets. And this is very relevant to kind of keep in mind where the company needs to go.
Are these ambitions approved by steering committee already? Have you evaluated them and checked against science-based targets methodology? Are they approved?
Sony, yes. It has been approved. RICO is in the process, but it's. I cannot say what the decision will be, but I think it's only a matter of time, you know, to go through the whole administrative process to be officially approved. Yeah.
Just a follow-up question on the Sony target. Was there, in the steering committee, was there any discussion about how the two main targets on production are qualitative? And it seems like they're pushing the quantitative result to 2050, which who knows what we're going to be doing by 2050, and the people setting the target probably are not going to be around. So for me, the Sony target seems, I would like to see the steering committee put a bit of a higher bar on the Scope 3 emissions.
Pedro? I wasn't in part of that discussion, so maybe you have some insight.
Yeah, I mean, the Scope 3 is challenging, and is challenging to evaluate. I think, you know, they have commitments. I think they have one quantified commitment, which is very important, on energy consumption of their products, which is where the large majority of their Scope 3 is. So the use of sold products phase. And then, yeah, it's true they have these qualitative targets in terms of engagement with their suppliers, etc. We hope that after a few years of that, it will be possible to set more quantitative targets. That's also, I believe, what we see through our supply chain program, is that these things take time. There is a process. And so our main ambition is to begin to see companies really addressing this challenge. And that's why we set criteria as, please do the screening, where you can have quantitative, time-bounded, but qualitative is also fine if you are addressing key areas of your supply chain which might be more complex to address. But it's always a little bit discretionary, and we recognize that, or at least I do.
Yep. Okay. One other question there.
Olena Valichko, Nordea. I'm just wondering, how do you go about choosing the base year? Do you have any recommendations? We've seen 2000 and 2007. Thank you.
So it basically depends on the company and the data availability for the company. We would recommend that the base year should not be too far in the past, because a target might sound very ambitious if you say, well, the base year is 2000, but actually now we're already in 2015, and it might sound very, very ambitious, but in reality, a company might have already reached, the largest part of the target or achieved the largest part of the target. So it should not be too much in the past. But I don't know, Pedro, if you have any more specific recommendation.
It definitely depends on the data availability. There are some companies and even some sectors that have been doing this for a very long time. They have set their base years in 1990, in accordance also with the FCCC process. it's probably going to be difficult for them to change, but they also have a very complete data set going back to 1990. So it's easier to assess. If you are not in that position, we would recommend, closer to us and where you have better data. Yeah, it's also something that will vary from company to company.
Yeah, but to do analysis, for example, for the Mind to Science report, it is very relevant to also have the data of historical emissions of the company.
Yeah, maybe one small comment. I think it's also very important that you take, let's say, a normal year for your company, so not an exceptional year where you had very high emissions or very low emissions. That is really important because with that you really influence the results. And I think also if you choose the SDA methodology, the tool does not allow to choose a base year much
prior to 2010.
Yeah, because that is where the scenario data starts.
Yeah, thank you, Kaspar. Very, very important addition. Okay. So, continuing, I have some guidance for financial institutions. There is a lot of interest from financial institutions in this initiative or topic, which is great. We invite financial institutions to set a target for their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. But as indicated before, for financial institutions, Scope 3, especially investment portfolio, etc., are the most relevant emissions. So it is for us difficult. Well, on the one hand, currently we don't have any indicators or detailed methodology to easily set a target, a science-based target for the investment portfolio. So we invite companies to express their interest to develop a science-based target, and then we basically want to work with those financial institutions to come up with more detailed guidance or methodological approaches to actually set targets in the part of emissions that are most relevant for the company. So there is work ongoing by WRI about financial institutions, and other initiatives are existing to try to come up with more specific indicators for that sector. So this is the guidance I can provide at the moment, and I'm afraid, we cannot go any further at this stage. But we are very interested in continuing the discussion and get into a dialogue with those companies. Then, to finalize my presentation, the last step is the target announcement. So when a company joins the call to action, it will be profiled on the Science Based Target website. And I also mentioned that we are closely working with the CDP Commitment to Action team and the We Mean Business team, and we align all our websites. So Emma, you have showed the CDP website before. That's basically going to be the same content as the two other websites. Depending on where the company stands, if it takes a commitment but doesn't have a target yet, we will just list the company on the website. If the company already has a target, we will of course develop more detailed information about that target. Besides, being on the website and being used in social media channels, etc., there are also other opportunities for the company. It of course always depends if the company already has a target in place, it has been announced before, and it's in line with climate science, or if a company really announces a new target. So depending on where the company stands, of course, there are different opportunities. In general, there are possibilities for companies to be actively involved in events. For example, we will have an event in New York next week where we invite several companies to speak, write blogs or opinion editorials in different fora. Would also be a great opportunity, and also be quoted in press releases. So we plan to do several milestones and announcements from now to end of the year, but also in the future. And this is, of course, also an opportunity for companies. Before we go into the last discussion, I just wanted to mention, I already mentioned that we have an events section on our website. You can have a look there. There are several different events, webinars, recurrent webinars that we organize, but also webinars organized by different organizations, such as the agricultural stakeholder workshop that Kaspar has mentioned before. One event I wanted to mention specifically is the Caring for Climate Business Forum, which will take place in December as part of the COP21, the global climate negotiations. There are 2 days. The first day is actually kind of open to everybody. It's a plenary. There will be plenary and thematic sessions on different topics. And one of the main topics, one of the focus topics will be science-based targets. So there will be for sure an opportunity for companies again to speak about their commitments or their targets. I heard last week that I think there's space for several hundred, 700 participants. We already have, or UN Global Compact or Care for Climate already has quite a number of participants, about 400, I think, but I'm not sure. But in case you're interested in participating there, please go to the website, Caring for Climate Business Forum, and you can request an invitation there. The second day is much smaller. It will be inside the official negotiation area, and it's only very high-level people and only restricted invitations. But I think, it could be a great opportunity for some companies represented here to participate during the first day. Now, maybe I already took some questions. Maybe I can take some additional questions, and then the plan is that after 12, we can maybe show you the online tool briefly, and also answer questions that you don't want to ask now in the plenary, and questions that you don't want to be recorded on the video. So any additional questions? No? One, Magnus?
It's not a question, but I'm Magnus Enfel of WWF. But since Carol was so modest, I want to mention that there is actually work going on, as you also mentioned, about looking into how this kind of approach can be applied and used by financial institutions, including efforts which we are really appreciating this work being done by your team, focusing on the corporate sector, but how this approach can be used for financial institutions or similar approaches. So there's a vivid interest among stakeholders from the financial community, and I'd be happy to speak to any of you who would like to pick up on this and learn more, but also we want to learn from you, how could an approach like this look like to be useful to you?
Thank you, Magnus. One question there in the back.
Johan Jarklev, Skanska. Do you foresee that this methodology could be driven more by the consumers or by the market?
What do you mean exactly? Instead of companies, or?
Yeah, it's more market-driven, like that consumers are asking for products or for companies that are aligned with the scientific-based targets?
So I think the consumers, I mean, there are different approaches. On the one hand, the company, can take voluntary action and kind of improve their product portfolio and kind of give the customer less broad selection, or only, basically sell more energy efficient products, but it can be the other way around, you know, that consumers put pressure on companies to take action. And it's similar to the case of the electric utility sector, right? Either they take action themselves, or companies like large power consumers actually say that, look, we want to consume or buy less carbon intensive energy from you, so you better start adapting your portfolio. So it's always important that all the different players start working, and depending on which part you talk about, the companies might take action themselves, or they need some pressure. Yeah. Okay. Do you want to?
Yeah, really, just take the opportunity to say thank you, Carol, for fantastic, illustration of what's going on, and to Pedro too. Thank you very much for joining us. And this isn't the end. We can show you the tool if you're interested, and yeah, offline conversations welcome now. So thanks very much for your time. Also, we will circulate the slides as in PDF to everybody afterwards, so you'll get all of that. I think that's it, apart from saying thank you again to SEB for your generosity in providing the venue and the refreshments, and thank you all for coming. Okay, thank you.
Yes. Thank you very much for coming here, and also don't forget my pitch there. If you need finance for renewable solutions, just come to us. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's see if I can sign this.